So we're going to continue this morning with where we left off in yesterday's class. We've got a couple more things to look at in the first chapter of Judges, and then we're going to move on to our class about God giving them judges. You'll remember yesterday that we went through the story of Adonai-Bezek. And Adonai-Bezek is an iconic story that's put there at the beginning of Judges. And it's put there to show us what God's ultimate plan is with Canaanite thinking, which is ultimately to destroy it, to completely remove it from the face of the earth at the end of the millennium. There's another story then that we find in Joshua chapter 1 that's another iconic story, and that's the story of Caleb and his family. And it's a very important story for us to look at. I thought I heard a little bump there for a second. So the story of Caleb and his family is indeed presented to us for a very important reason in this chapter. Let's take a look at Judges chapter 1, and we're going to look at verse 8. It says, "Now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem, and had taken it and smitten it with the edge of the sword." And you remember that this is a part of a flashback to the times of Caleb. So now we're switching back and we're making a contrast. We're making a comparison to the great success that Caleb had, his family had, and Judah had when he was one of the leaders of Judah. And it's telling us about this. So then as we move forward, we look at verse 9. It says, "And afterward, the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites that dwelt in the mountain and in the south and in the valley." So these men of Judah, with Caleb as their leader, we find out, if we go back to Joshua, they went and they fought against the Canaanites. And you'll notice where they fought. And this is an important thing to note in your margin, I think, is they fought in the mountain, they fought in the south, and they fought in the valley. Now we're fighting against Canaanites. Basically what this is telling us is they fought the Canaanites everywhere. And that's a contrast to what we see happening in Judges chapter 1. Because later on, the men of Judah are afraid to go up against the Canaanites of the valley because of their chariots of iron. And we think about choosing which Canaanites to fight against. There's a very important lesson for us to consider. In our lives, there are many different ways that Canaanite thinking comes into our lives and attacks us. And there are some things that are very easy for us to deal with. And there are other things that are not very easy for us to deal with. Those things are going to take a whole lot more effort. And we'll spend a minute on those in a little bit. The point here is setting us up for the fact that Caleb and his family fought against the Canaanites absolutely everywhere. The next verse, in verse 10, it makes that clear to us. It says, "And Judah went against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron." Now the name of Hebron before was Kirjath Arba. That's a reference to the giant that lived there. "And they slew Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai." Again, these are the giants that lived in the land. These are the giants that made Israel afraid to go into the land and to fight against the Canaanites. Take a quick trip with me over to Numbers chapter 13. In Numbers chapter 13, the children of Israel were about to go into the land. The spies had been sent out. The spies brought back their evil report, and they said, "We can't do it because of the giants in the land." Numbers chapter 13, verse 22, talks about what they saw. It says, "And they ascended by the south, and they came to Hebron," where there's those names again, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the children of Anak were. So there's the same place, the same guys. We've got the same Caleb that's gone into this area. And Caleb says, there's no problem. If we skip down to verse 30 of that verse, it says, "Caleb stilled the people before Moses, and he said, 'Don't worry about the giants. Let's go up at once and possess it, for we are able to overcome it.'" We're able to do it. That was the faith of Caleb. That's the gold standard. That's the guy that we're trying to be like when we're looking at these things. He's the one that sets the example as a tremendous leader in Israel. And so he goes, and he fights, and he defeats them, and he's successful. So come back over with me now to Judges chapter 1. Judges 1 and verse 12. Point number 8 on our list. Be a leader and attack Canaanite thinking that is holding others back. That's what Caleb did, and that's the key point here that's presented for us in the life of Caleb. And Caleb goes beyond that now, and his family goes beyond that. In verse 12 it says, "And Caleb said, He that smiteth Kirjath-sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Achsah my daughter to wife." So he says, I'm going to actually give my daughter to wife to someone that is a conqueror of Canaanites. Someone that will go out and conquer Canaanites. Now, there's a happy coincidence, I think, here, in that I have a daughter, and I too will not allow someone to marry my daughter that is not a conqueror of Canaanites. In fact, I have 2 daughters that I won't allow to do that. But I have one specifically that I would not allow unless they were a person like Caleb to go out and to fight against the Canaanites. Right? Inside joke for some maybe, but but don't tell Caleb that I said that, okay? Okay, verse 13. "And Othniel the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him Achsah his daughter to wife." So Othniel becomes the first judge. He's a great type of Christ if you were to do a study on that. They've removed the Canaanites from the land, and what happens next? In verse 14 it says, "And it came to pass, when she came to him," so Achsah comes to him, "and she moved him to ask of her father a field." Canaanites are removed from the land, and she wants a field. What's the point? What's the scriptures telling us here? This is like the next level of removing the Canaanites. She wants to have a field. We think about the parable of the sower. Maybe it's the best connection that we have there. She wants to have a place where she can grow things. She wants to have a place where she can grow the Word of God. And so she asks for a field. This is amazing, because this is the next step, isn't it? After driving out the Canaanites, is to begin to use our minds for a much better, bigger purpose, which is growing the fruit that God can use in his kingdom. And so we continue in verse 14, and it says, "And she lighted off her ass, and Caleb said to her, What wilt thou? And she said unto him, Give me a blessing, for thou hast given me a south land. Give me also springs of water. Give me springs of the word of God," she says. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the nether springs. So she wanted a supply of water, the word of God for her ecclesia, in the type that we have before us in this story. And she planted an ecclesia. And Caleb planted an ecclesia. And the ecclesia was absolutely thriving in that area. And we'll see that in just a minute. But I think we need to add number 9. So once we've worked on doing these other things, if we don't replace that Canaanite thinking with the fields that can bring forth the word of God, then we've missed out. We've missed a very important step in the work of God and of being faithful servants of God. And what happens when you do that? Well, the next thing we read about in this chapter is the Kenites. Who are the Kenites? Where did the Kenites come from? The Kenites were Gentiles that had descended from Jethro. The Kenites were people that dwelt in tents. The Kenites were people that through most of Israel's history, all the way up until the times of the exiles, when they returned, they were people that actually were with Israel. And the reason that they wanted to be with Israel, because they knew that Israel was blessed by God, because they saw that the truth was there. So they're descended from Jethro. You remember Jethro and Moses' father-in-law. They're descended from his family, and they're a group of people that live amongst the Israelites throughout their history. And when they're building the wall in Nehemiah's time, the Kenites are also there building the wall with them. That's who the Kenites are. And the Kenites, in this case, are people that saw the ecclesia that Caleb and his family had built. And what did they do? Because they saw how strong that ecclesia was, because they saw the faithfulness of those people, that field that was growing, they decided that they wanted to move there as well. So let's look at verse 16. It says, "And the children of the Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lieth in the south of Arad, and they went and they dwelt among the people." These were families that wanted to be there in the spiritual strength of Caleb's ecclesia and Caleb and Judah's ecclesias. They saw that. They saw how great a thing it would to be a part of that. And so they moved their families right there. Now, I think that's a very powerful lesson for us. I think that if we, with our families, if we can find a way to move our families to a place where there are Calebs, where there are teachers, people that are planting the seed, it'll be a very beneficial thing to us. And if we can't do that, then bring those Calebs to our ecclesias. And we can make a big difference with what happens in our ecclesias by doing that. That's exactly the lesson of the Kenites. And that's exactly, we'll see them later on in a couple days, we'll see how the Kenites, well, I guess it's tomorrow now, but we'll see how the Kenites play in again and how a faithful Kenite helps out in the war against the Canaanites. So that's number 10. Find a way for spiritual warriors to rub off on your family and on your ecclesia. Find a way to do that. Whatever it takes, find a way to make that happen. If you do, you'll be very happy that you did, because it will really be a benefit to your ecclesia. All right, let's go back to or look at Judges then at verse 17. It says, "And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they slew the Canaanites that inhabited Zephath and utterly destroyed it. And the name of the city was called Hormah. Also Judah took Gaza with the coast thereof, and Askelon with the coast thereof, and Ekron with the coast thereof." Then verse 19 kind of gives us a summary of Judah's work. It says, "And Yahweh was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron." So there's that contrast with what Caleb was able to do in his day, and now Judah is unable to fight against the valley, the inhabitants of the valley, because of the iron chariots. So what are these giants, these iron chariots, these opponents, and how do we deal with them? We've already talked about what they are, but how do we go about driving them out of our lives? Right? It's some sins are easy. How do we go about driving out the more difficult sins in our lives? There's a similar wording used in Matthew chapter 17, and I think it's helpful to look at. Matthew chapter 17, this is the case where the disciples were unable to drive out an epileptic, the evil spirit from an epileptic. And they were unable to do that because of their lack of faith. It's told to us very clearly in Matthew chapter 17. It says, "Then came the disciples," Matthew 17, verse 19, "Then came the disciples to Jesus apart and said, Why could not we cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, Because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say to the mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting." And I think that's the answer. If you've got something that you're having a very difficult time driving out, if you've got some sin that is plaguing you, that's become a demon in your life, prayer and fasting. Now, the prayer is easy. We understand what that's talking about. You're building your relationship with God in order to drive that out. And if you make that a big part of your life, if you make that an important part of your life, that will have its effect. What about fasting? We never fast, right? We never do that. So what's it talking about, fasting? So in Bible times, when you fasted, right, every day you had to work in order to earn food so that you would eat that day. But for us, we eat regardless, somehow. That's not an issue for us. But for them, if they fasted, that meant that they could spend the day focusing, thinking about, talking about the Word of God. That's what they could do. So for us, it's exactly the same. If we want to drive these things out of our lives, it's prayer, and it's focusing on the Word of God. It's putting aside other responsibilities that we have and focusing on this. Making our priorities right in order to drive out the Canaanites from our lives. I think you'll know what I mean when you think about when you go home from Bible school, right? Those giants, they're weaker, aren't they? When you go home, it's really the perfect time when you get home from Bible school to strike, because they've been weakened because they haven't had the access while you've been here at Bible school. It's a great opportunity then for us to look at that. All right, and then, I guess I didn't put my 11th one. I'll have to read you my 11th point then. The 11th point is build your relationship with God through prayer and listening to His Word. Number 11 would be build your relationship with God through prayer and listening to His Word. All right, so that takes us through what we were going to talk about yesterday. Now we're going to take a look at Judges chapter 2. So at the end of chapter 1, we have a whole bunch of failures by Israel. We've just looked at a great big list of all the things we should be doing, and now we're presented with a whole bunch of failures that Israel ran into when they were fighting against the Canaanites. Right? If you go down to verse 21, it says, "And Benjamin did not drive out." House of Joseph, it says they went up against Bethel, and Yahweh was with them, but they ended up making a covenant with the Canaanites. That's verses 22 to 26. And then starting in verse 27, it talks about Manasseh not driving out, but instead putting the Canaanites to tribute. They thought that they could handle that Canaanite influence because it had a nice financial benefit for them. Verse 29 to 33, we have Ephraim, we have Zebulun, we have Asher, we have Naphtali, all of them failing to drive out. Verse 34, the worst of the bunch. We've got Dan, and what happened to Dan? Dan was actually forced out of his inheritance in this case. So the summary is that they did not drive out. The summary is that the nation was in big trouble. So how does chapter 2 break down for us? Chapter 2, the first 5 verses talk to us about, or tell us about an angel that comes from Bochim. 6 to 9 is a flashback again, like we had yesterday. We had a few flashbacks yesterday. Today we have one to the death of Joshua. And then 10 to 23 is the failure of the generation that knew not Yahweh, wrapping up the chapter there. We look at that. And it looks at the cycle. But Judges chapter 2 then is really about God giving judges to the nation of Israel. Now, one of the things that happened to me when I first started to study the book of Judges was I was very puzzled with the fact that the judges are called judges. Now, it's going to be a really confusing thing to you for a minute or two. Maybe I can bring that so you'll understand what I'm talking about. Picture a judge wearing his wig and his gavel, right? That's what a judge is. Now picture the judges of the book of Judges. Picture Samson, picture Gideon, picture Deborah and Barak. These were warriors. They weren't people sitting with a gown on, like we might consider in our world with a judge. They weren't like that. They were pounding the gavel and saying guilty or innocent. That's not what they were like. And yet the scriptures actually uses a term that's what it means. A judge, a person making a decision on a case. And that's the idea behind it. So how does that work? How do we reconcile that? That God says that I'm going to call these people judges, even though they're not judges in the minds, or at least as we perceive a judge to be. Now, we don't really read that much about that role for them. We do read about it a little bit with Deborah, and it looks like there's a little bit of that role with Gideon as well. But we don't really read that role of them being judges like that. So why are they called judges? Well, who's the first judge? Maybe it's important for us to understand in Israel what a judge was. Who was the first judge in Israel? Moses, right? You remember the story of Moses being the judge? Remember how every morning the people would come to him and he would sit in front of the people, and they would line up in front of him, and they would bring their cases to him, and it would be case after case. And he started early in the morning, and he went all day long until the end of the day. And you remember Jethro was with him one of the times when this was happening. And Jethro says to him, "What on earth are you doing? Why are you're going to wear the people out because they're coming to you all day long and you're making decisions for them." He says, "This is absolutely crazy what you're doing." And Jethro has a solution for him. You remember what the solution was? Jethro says, "You've got to get some help. You've got to have more and more people that are acting as judges, and you could be the judge that is the supreme judge, the leading judge, and the others can make the smaller decisions for you," is what ends up being the decision or the advice that he gets. Let's look at Exodus chapter 18 just for a minute about this, because there's a really good connection here, I think, when we look at it, between what the judge's role was and maybe what was left out in the way that most people perceived the role of the judge to be. Because most people, us included, forget a big part of the role of what a judge actually is. So Exodus chapter 18, verse 16. So Jethro thought Moses was crazy. Moses is now going to explain to him what he's doing. Exodus 18, verse 16, it says, "And when they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws." So I'm going to put up here the role of the judges, and we'll read through these and we'll see that these are actually the roles of the judges as we go through them. So the first one is to make the people to know the statutes of God and his laws. Well, Jethro says to him, "You're going to wear everybody out. I've got a suggestion for you." Go down to verse 20. He says, "Thou shalt teach them the ordinances and laws. Thou shalt show them the way wherein they must walk and the work that they must do." So teach them the ordinances and the laws, the second one, and then the third one, show them the way that they should walk and the work that they should do. And he says, "I want you also to share this responsibility with others." We come down to verse 21. He says, "Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men." That word able is actually the same word used for the virtuous woman. So these are men of strength, such as fear God. They have to have fear for God because they're going to be upholding God's laws. They have to believe that God's laws are important. Men of truth. They have to be honest. They can't be people that tell lies. Hating covetousness. They can't be bribed. And he says, "And place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s." All of that makes great sense to me, but I'm a little bit wondering about this idea of rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. Do we really need a judge for 10 people? Because that's what he's saying here. You need to have a judge over 10 people. Well, automatically, I think we're starting to think that this idea of a judge, maybe we're not quite understanding what it is exactly, because there's no way in the world that we need that many judges for our society in the way that we understand a judge to act today. So what's he describing for us? He's describing for us a system of leadership, a system of governance, if you will, for Israel, all the way from Moses' time, all the way up to the times of the kings, and really even into that time. And it's a system that we're told will actually be used in the kingdom as well, this system of the judges. Interesting. So what is he describing here? You know, it sounds remarkably like the ecclesial setup that we follow today, right? There's no central leadership, not really, nothing sophisticated. The leaders work in small groups, even down to very small groups like families. Their focus is on teaching and showing people how to live their lives. And they make sure that people follow the right path. Their job is to stop people, in this case, from getting away from doing God's will to doing what's right in their own eyes. So in that aspect, it makes perfect sense that a judge is going to stop people from doing what's right in their eyes and get them to do what's right in God's eyes. But the key point I want you to take away from this is that it's like ecclesias. It's like our families and ecclesias in its setup in how it worked. Now, what do we do? What do we use to help each other to do all of these things, to stay on the right path when they go astray, when someone goes astray? What would we do? Wouldn't we turn to Matthew chapter 18? Isn't that where we would go? We would say, hey, there's this brother or this sister that's gone astray, not on a personal thing, not something that was just irritating to us, but if they've actually gone astray from God's commands, then we would go to them and we would talk to them. Right? Matthew 18 says, if your brother trespass, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone, and if he hears thee, thou hast gained thy brother. That's what Scriptures tells us. A neat quote, I think, from the Ecclesial Guide from Brother Robert Roberts. He says, when that happens, when we follow Matthew 18, and there's more steps to Matthew 18, but when we follow that first step, because that's the most important, he says, each brother then becomes a seeing eye and a protecting hand of the ecclesia. We've got this system that actually is just like the system of the judges. It'll guide people and it'll lead them in their lives. And it will stop people from every man doing that which is right in their own eyes. Very nice, very interesting, very, very important connection that we make here with the ecclesia. So after the disappointing performance of Israel at the end of chapter 1, we find all of Israel's gathered together at the beginning of chapter 2. Verse 4 tells us that. Verse 4 tells us that all of them are together. All of Israel, the angel speaks to all of Israel, all the children of Israel. And you can imagine the meeting. I picture the meeting kind of like each tribe gets up and says, well, here's how we've done in driving out the Canaanites. And here's how we've done. And here's how we've done. And the people were saying, well, we really haven't done a good job. We've got some real problems here. And then an angel of Yahweh comes to them and speaks to them in verse 1. It says, and an angel of Yahweh came from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt. I've brought you unto the land which I swear to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. So it's very unusual for an angel to appear before all the people like this and to speak to them. Verse 2, and ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. That's what he said. And ye shall throw down their altars. But you've not obeyed my voice. You haven't thrown down their altars. Why have you done this, he says. Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you. So God had told them already. He said, if you go into the land, I'll drive out the Canaanites if you drive them out. But if you don't, I won't. I'll leave them in the land. And they shall be as thorns in your sides. Their gods shall be a snare unto you. God had told them. And now the angel comes and says, we're here. I told you this was going to happen. You failed to do it. It's where we are. Imagine the people. Right? Imagine if we had an angel that came in and said that to us. Well, the people felt exactly like that. Verse 4, it says, and it came to pass when the angel of Yahweh spake these words unto the children of Israel, the people lifted up their voice, and they wept. And they called the name of the place Bochim, which means weepers, and they sacrificed there unto Yahweh. They wept because their hope had been lost. Right? Verse 10 tells us that. Time passes now. Verse 10 says, and all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which knew not Yahweh, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. So the first generation didn't get rid of the altars. The second generation knew not Yahweh. So how were the judges doing so far? Right? What was the role of the judges? But the next generation doesn't even know Yahweh. The next generation doesn't know Yahweh at all. So they completely failed in what they're doing. And the people were just doing what they thought was right and not what God thought was right. Verse 11, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they served Balaam, and they forsook Yahweh, the God, Yahweh Elohim, He who will be manifest in a multitude of the fathers, which brought them up out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods. And the gods of the people that were round about them, and they bowed themselves to them, and they provoked Yahweh to anger. They forsook Yahweh, served Baal and the Ashtaroth. It just got worse and worse. They had a different master now, a completely different master. They had the Baals as their master. How could we tell if we have a different master? How could you tell? Because it's going to be hard to tell if you have a different master, because you'll be doing what's right in your own eyes, and it'll seem like it's right when you have a different master. Well, one of the ways you could tell is by just examining your life. And you can actually, I think, tell what this other master is in your life by examining your life. So, do you miss the Bible readings? Might be an indication you have a different master. Do you miss Bible class? What about thoughtfully praying to God? What about personal Bible study? What about missing meeting? Right? These are all things we know that we're supposed to be doing. We don't need a list to know them, but if you looked at your life and you examined yourself, you'd say, well, maybe I do have another God. And would you like to know what that other God is? Well, what are you doing when you should be doing the Bible readings? What are you doing when you should be doing personal Bible study? That's your God. It's quite simple. It's quite simple. And yet we know the outcome of choosing another God is not good at all. It was terrible for Israel. They chose a different boss, a different leader, and that leader led them astray and brought them nothing that was good. Think about a terrible boss that you might have had in your career. A terrible, terrible boss. Maybe it was a boss that was never happy with what you'd done, never satisfied with what you did for them, always wanted more, and then never gave you what he promised to give you. Have you had that boss? Maybe one of those bosses you've had, right? Just one of those aspects. Well, sin, Canaanite thinking, is all of those. Promises you all these things and yet doesn't deliver you anything at all. We've got to make sure that Canaanite thinking is not our master. But if it is, the beauty of chapter 2 is that God is still working to bring Israel back, even after they did all those things. And you might think that when God said, okay, I'm not going to drive out the Canaanites anymore, that God was saying, I've had enough. I'm done. No more. It's just over. I asked you to do something. You didn't do it. We're done. But that's not how God works with us. Thankfully, that's not how God works for us. We put up the big list of all the things we should be doing, and we're probably failing on a lot of those things. God's still working with us. And that's the beauty, I think, of chapter 2 and the message of chapter 2 as we see it. We have this example of Canaanite thinking taking us astray, giving us what we deserve, which is not happiness, is not satisfaction, is not any of the things that it promised us that it would give us. And that's exactly what happened to Israel. They chose the ways of Canaan, and the Canaanites came in and they oppressed them. They destroyed their lives. Judges chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "And the anger of Yahweh was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about." He sold them. That's like if you sold your servant, is the idea behind that. I have a servant, and I sold him, and I said, okay, you're not my servant anymore. That's what he did. He said, I'll let you just go and be the servants of the Canaanites. He said, he did that. He sold them as servants so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. And he allowed their enemies to defeat them, to conquer them. Verse 15 says, whithersoever they went out, the hand of Yahweh was against them for evil. God was working against Israel to show them that they had chosen the wrong master. And that's the way God works in our lives too. We make the wrong choices and God says, okay, I'll let you have the results of that, and I will show you the wrong choice that you've made. As Yahweh had said, and as Yahweh had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. It was a very difficult time for them. And verse 21 shows us exactly what God was doing. He says, I will also not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died. I'm done with that. That through them I may prove Israel, whether they will keep the way of Yahweh to walk therein as their fathers did keep it, or not. Therefore Yahweh left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. And he did it to prove Israel, to see once again if Israel would obey or not. So God brings circumstances into their lives to make it abundantly clear to them that they've made the wrong choices. You ever had that experience? You ever had that experience where God made it very clear to you that you have made the wrong choice? Well, he's waiting for the next step, isn't he? He's waiting for you to say, I've made the wrong choice. And once you say I've made the wrong choice, then he says, okay, now I'm going to help you out. Now I can deliver you. And that's exactly what he does in the book of the Judges. Once we confess our mistake, we say, God, you were right and I was wrong, then God can work with us once again. That's how God works in our lives. Skipped over that. God allows, even brings difficulties into our lives to help us to see that his ways are better. And after he has shown us this, we must decide who our master will be. And this is how he proves us. We get another chance to make the right choice. And that's how he proves Israel. And that's how he works with them. Now you think about the cycle of the judges, right? You start with sin. You go to suffering. You go to supplication. And then saving. And God saves them. That's exactly the same process. He's got to get us to a place where we cry out for help. So Judges 2 verse 16. It says, nevertheless, Yahweh raised up judges, which delivered, which saved them out of the hands of those that spoiled them. And it was the judges that were doing the saving. It was the judges that delivered them from their enemies. And we have example after example of that taking place. Now, at first, that doesn't fit our example or our idea of what a judge is, does it? It doesn't fit with the role of the judge that we looked at earlier. They're saving people, but that's not saving people. Is it? Saving people? Maybe that is saving people. Maybe that is what God's doing. We think in our minds of a judge as being a decision maker. And we don't think of a judge as being someone that goes out and saves people. But that's exactly what a judge is. Now think about our position in the ecclesia. It's really easy for us to be the person that upholds the law and says, you are doing the wrong thing. It's really easy for us to be that part of the judge role. It's really easy for us to call people out when they make mistakes. The other part is much more difficult for us to do. The part that the other judges, our heroes of the book of Judges do, they take initiative. They step up. They lead people in the fight. And they do it alone at first, as they go out and risk their lives in order to help save other people. They don't just say, well, here's what you need to do. Go do it. They help you to do it. They show you how to do it. They take the first step in doing it. They give their life in order to save you. And what we find is this role of a judge is really twofold. This role of the judge is the first part, which is keeping God's commandments and upholding God's commandments. But it also has the second commandment to it. It also is about loving your neighbor as yourself. It's also about showing mercy. A judge has got to go out and to save the people that have sinned and have suffered. A judge has got to be there when people are in trouble. And we're the judges. Brothers and sisters, we're the judges. We're the thousands, the hundreds, the 50s, and the 10s. We're the ones that are supposed to be doing this. It's telling people they're doing wrong, and then it's saying, how can I help you to get back on track? And what can I do? How can I show you? How can I lead you? You know, the children of Israel in the New Testament, we come to the New Testament and we have Christ. And we're told that Christ was sitting in Moses' seat. That's telling us that Christ was taking on the role of a judge. He was standing up as the judge of Israel. Christ was. He was sitting, actually, in this case, as the judge of Israel. And we're told here that he says that you should do what the Pharisees say, but don't do what the Pharisees do. Because the Pharisees were the judges of Israel. They were the ones that were telling people what was right. It's just they weren't doing the second part of the role of a Pharisee. And that's exactly what Christ told them. You think about the different stories in the New Testament where they weren't ever people that cared about helping their brother or their sister. It was always about themselves and showing how much better they were by using the law to do that. So let's read verse 16 again. It says, "Nevertheless, Yahweh raised up judges which delivered them out of the hands that spoiled them." Now, it'd be great if we could stop right there and say, that was wonderful, right? They lived happily ever after at that point. But that's not where it ends. Because mostly the people didn't listen to the judges. So you think you're in that position and you're going to try to help your brother, and you go out and you do the things that are necessary. You go to their house, you meet their needs, and you help them in the situation that they're in. And guess what happens next? They do it again. They do exactly the same thing again, because that's probably what's going to happen. That's the way we are, right? Verse 17, "And yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, bowed themselves unto them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of Yahweh." They stopped obeying the commandments of Yahweh, and they didn't do the right thing, but they did not so. Now you and I, at that point, would say, enough with the mercy. Right? We'd say, that's it. We've done our part. They're just not going to come around. They're just not going to get it. Let's go back to justice. Let's go back to just the letter of the law at this point. Verse 18, the pattern keeps going. "And when Yahweh raised them up judges, then Yahweh was with that judge, and he delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repented Yahweh because of their groanings, by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them." So even though the people kept failing, what does God do for them? Every single time the children of Israel cry unto Yahweh, God's mercy is there. His grace is there. He works with them. He gives them the tools. He keeps humbling their enemies, and he keeps strengthening their enemies in order, back and forth, in order to bring them around. Always ready to hear their cry for help. Yahweh raised up a Savior over and over again. And then verse 19. "It came to pass when the judge was dead that they returned, and they corrupted themselves more than their fathers." What is that telling us? They were getting worse. They were getting worse in following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. The sin cycle, the cycle of the judges, I should say, got worse and worse and worse. And yet God's mercy keeps coming back. 6 times they sinned, 6 times they cried to God, 6 times God heard them. Why do you think it's 6 that are recorded for us? 6 cycles. Man, that's us. Judges is about us and our failures, and God's mercy to us in our failures. It's about how God delivers us and helps us in those times, in those difficulties. So So what are the lessons then for us if we look at this? If we were to put these lessons together that we've looked at today, number one is God allows, even brings difficulties into our lives to help us to see that his ways are better. After he's shown us this, we must decide who our master will be. This is how he proves us. But we've got to keep both aspects of the role of the judge. We uphold the truth. We teach it to our brothers and sisters and families and those around us. We've got to do that. It's got to be God's truth. It has to be that. And then we do everything we can to save our brothers and sisters by showing the same mercy that God shows. I think about the woman taken in adultery that was brought to Christ. The woman was taken in adultery, and the Pharisees thought, oh, this is really great. We can bring her to Christ, and we can see what he'll say. We can get him, trip him up in his decision. Did they care at all about the well-being of the woman that was taken in adultery? They didn't. They didn't care about her one bit. All they cared about was discrediting Christ in what they did. And so they brought her to Christ. And it's very neat when you look at the chapter, John chapter 8, you see a picture of Christ as the judge. And the woman comes to him and he saves her. His intent is not to condemn her. His intent is to convict her, to make her recognize her position and to get her to repent. Now, we don't know if she repented, but Christ follows the example of the judges and gives her that opportunity to do that. And the beauty of that story is, who else does he convict and convince that they're doing the wrong thing? He says, let the man without sin cast the first stone. So all of us, well, we may think we're upholding God's law, we may think that we're going out and we're helping others. We've been forgiven first. God's mercy has come upon us first. We've got to follow God's example. And that's the lesson of the judges. And we'll go through the story tomorrow of Deborah and Barak. And we'll see how Barak is resistant and hesitant to go out. And we'll see how a lot of people refuse to go out and to come to the battle. And then on Friday, Lord willing, we'll look at Gideon and see how one man was urged by God to overcome his fears and how he was able to stand up and to deliver the people in this way. So hopefully that gives us a nice picture of the purpose of the judges and how God was working with Israel. And now we can look at a couple of actual stories in the book of Judges. Thank you.